Today, I want to talk about boundaries. And if I'm being honest, when I first thought of this topic, I thought, habits and trying to make changes in our life, it's really important that we address setting boundaries and trying to maintain them as best we can. But I did realize with everything that is going on right now, it's a stressful time. And I think boundaries are more important than ever. So today we're going to talk about them. And this is especially helpful if anyone out there is struggling a little bit with boundaries. And there are so many to unpack. Now, before we get started, I do want to quickly introduce myself if you are new. My name is Kat, and I help people uncover the hidden reasons that they get stuck so they can break free and start thriving. Now, when it comes to boundaries, I really at first thought about being able to say no to things that aren't serving you or to be able to maintain some structure in your life that helps and supports your changes. For some of us, including myself, it can be hard to say no to a person who's maybe asking something of us. I'm an obliger, and I know that's a common problem. And I know I am not alone. But I also realize that right now, there are a lot of us who are trying to figure out what are some boundaries in our life around the people that we engage with, the content that we let into our life, everything that we sort of let enter our space. It's really important that we're asking ourselves, what do I want to be able to come into my life? How do I want to feel? How do I want to spend my time? All those questions are really important. So I'll use a few different examples, but I think that this really is a lot bigger than what I had first imagined. Now, because it's Get Unstuck Wednesday, I always want to follow the 3 different ways that we get stuck. And so if you need a reminder, the 3 ways we get stuck, one is that we're missing information. So we maybe don't have a skill. We're not able to make a change. The next way we get stuck is when we're missing information about ourselves and we're accidentally working against our own tendency. And finally, an adaptive challenge. This is when we know what to do and how to do it, but we're still not doing it. This is when we need to change our mindset. Something that we believe is keeping us stuck. We have a limiting belief that is holding us back. So that is the framework I'm going to use today and what I do every time we talk about why we get stuck. Now, when it comes to setting boundaries, let's dive into some of the things that might be getting in your way. So the first area where we want to look is on, am I missing information or skills? Are there things that make me unable to set boundaries? And well, the first one is, are you clear on them? Like sometimes we want to have boundaries, but we just don't actually have them. And so being able to say, what are my boundaries? Could I tell someone what my boundaries are? That's a really important place to start. Now, how do we actually set a boundary? Well, one of the things is you need to identify your values and your principles. Like literally, we need to know, what do you believe in? Whether this is how I want to spend my time, how I want to spend my energy. Like you can't set a boundary if you haven't identified these values and these principles that you hold close to you. Once you spend a little bit of time identifying those values and those principles, it makes it easier for you to be clear and clarify those boundaries. The other thing is, how do I want to spend my time? And I literally mean spending your time. How do we have boundaries so that we support the stuff we want to get done or accomplish? But also, when we're spending our time, how are we spending it? What are we doing? Is it around people that we want to be around? Is it around information? Are we doing something that is aligned with our values and our principles? So it's not all just about time and schedule, although that is important. We need to know how we're spending it, but also what am I doing during that time? How am I spending my mental bandwidth, in other words? Now, the other thing is, how do you want to feel? So if I want to feel uplifted or empowered, or I want to feel connected to other people, I'm going to want to make sure that I'm in situations where that's fostered and that I can support that. But if we don't actually know or ask ourselves, how do I want to feel? Then that's a really great place to start. So spending some time, what are your values? What are your principles? And how do I actually want to feel? So when it comes to getting stuck, the next place we want to look is this working with yourself or not? And so the next thing you want to ask is around, do I know myself well? Now, every single time I talk about understanding yourself, I always bring up external accountability because for some of us, it's so helpful for making a change and getting unstuck is to learn what is the way that I best operate. Sometimes we need external accountability as a way for us to set those boundaries, whether that is actually setting boundaries maybe on your schedule using an application like screen time or having something automatically shut down. Like if we don't want to be spending all of our day online scrolling, but some of us, we get pulled into it, can you actually set a time limit? That's an external accountability tool that will say, hey, you have a value of how much time you want to spend online. You've reached that time limit. For some people, that works really well. For other people, not so much. The other is you can tell people in advance about your boundaries. So whether that's a person you work with, a person that you care about, someone that you trust, you could say, hey, things are really busy right now. I need to make sure I'm not taking on too much. So later, if there's a situation where that person that you trust might be able to flag and say, hey, you said you didn't want to take on too much, but you've said yes to this new thing or you're taking on this new project, they're a nice way to check in with you. And it's an external person who's able to tell you maybe you are stepping outside of those boundaries that you had committed to, or at least that you want to stick to. And I think that's really important. Let me know in the comments, whether you're live or watching the replay, is this something that you use? Do you use external tools to help you to maintain the boundaries that you want to set? Because for some of us, like me, I will say one thing, but actually doing it is a little bit harder when it's just me at the driver's seat. But when other people or tools are involved, I find it a lot easier. Which leads me to the next thing. If you are someone who maybe struggles to say no and they say yes more than they want, don't answer requests right away. Do you have some time? Could you practice, instead of saying yes to something, maybe an external request or something that comes up, or even just something you see that excites you and you want to do it, to check with yourself. So if another person invites you to take part in something, and maybe it's outside those boundaries, but you feel compelled to say yes for whatever reason, instead of just answering, you could say, oh, this is really interesting. I'm going to get back to you. Or I will let you know by tomorrow. If you need a timeline, that's great, but you don't always have to commit or answer right away. And I think that's a really important thing for people to remember, is that you don't have to make a decision. You can have the time. Another thing that's really great is to say, I'm going to check my calendar and see if that's something that can work. It's not a commitment. It is a way of showing that you might have interest, and maybe you do. Now, if you don't have any interest at all, you could say no, but I know there are a lot of us who don't necessarily want to just squash something right away. So by saying, I'll get back to you, it's a way to buy some time and maybe practice how you want to set your boundary, how you want to decline that invitation. You can do it in a nice way where it's still aligned with your principles and with how you want to interact with other people. The other thing is like practice. There are so many ways to set boundaries and to be clear and share with others what our boundaries actually are. And it might be helpful for you to practice saying it a few different ways. Find something that feels comfortable for you. And the other thing when it comes to boundaries is you get to pick how much you do or do not disclose to another person. You don't owe anyone any kind of explanation for why you are choosing to set this boundary. You might simply say, no, thank you. You might choose to give a little bit of information. You might even choose to share a bit of a white lie. And that's okay if that's what it takes for you to respect and to maintain your boundaries. But practicing is a really great way so that whenever you're faced with a request or something that comes up, you can actually say it in a way that feels comfortable for you, because there are all sorts of ways to be clear and express your boundaries. All right, let's get to the next part, which is the most important part and where a lot of us struggle when it comes to identifying, setting, and maintaining boundaries. And this is when we have fears of, well, if I set a boundary or if I maintain a boundary, this bad thing might happen. So we're going to take a look at a few of these fears, but these fears are connected to some beliefs that we have, and that's the second part. So when it comes to beliefs around boundaries, the first one, and this comes up a lot, harm to relationships. So maybe I want to set a boundary about how much time I spend with other people or with friends or acquaintances. Well, when it comes to this, if I picture saying no to friends, I have this fear that maybe it's going to damage our relationship. If I say no when they ask me to do something, maybe they'll stop asking me altogether. We have this fear that it's going to shift things. The other is that maybe someone is bringing up a topic that is outside of your boundary. You don't want to discuss this topic, for whatever reason. But there are things, and I know I have them, where I get emotional, I get heated, I don't want to get into it. And so respecting my boundaries would be to say, I don't really want to discuss this. However, that can feel like an affront to another person. And for someone like me who doesn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, I often find myself not necessarily asserting where I stand on something because I don't want to harm someone. I don't want to harm our relationship, especially if I care about someone, even if we don't agree on the same subject matter. The other is sometimes when we assert boundaries, we feel like we're being selfish or that we don't care about other people. If they ask us to do something and we say no, we can start to feel really bad about it, or we can feel like somehow we are putting ourselves over other people. And that can be a fear that will come across as if we don't care about other people or what they're asking. The other is sometimes it feels really rigid or inflexible to stick to boundaries, to actually set them and decide this is what I'm going to do. It can feel permanent or like you've committed to something and you can't change your mind. And so sometimes we can get stuck with that idea that boundaries means that you're inflexible somehow. The other idea is that you might not want to say no to something because you don't want to be deprived. You don't want to miss out. I know sometimes when groups of old friends will say, hey, let's get together, or let's plan a call or whatnot, and it's a really busy period of time, I really do want to catch up with people. So it is difficult for me to say, I can't do that right now. I know they're going to get together and it would have probably been lovely, but I need to make sure that I'm respecting my boundaries. I'm not always good at that. Sometimes I will let the fact that I want to catch up with people supersede that, and I will say yes, and maybe I am stressed and I maybe shouldn't have done that. And I learned the hard way. Let me know if that is something you also experience. You just don't want to miss out. Here's the thing, it doesn't always involve other people. Sometimes it's just boundaries with ourselves. So a silly example might be, I want to read all the books. And so I get it, or I take it out of the library, or do something because I want to enjoy that thing. I want to learn that new thing, and I get really excited about it. But as far as boundaries go, I just can't do it. There's always a trade-off. When you pick one thing, you have to say no to another thing. And so it's not always about other people. It could be your own experiences, things that you sign up for, things that you commit to, and then you realize, I've committed to too much. And there's also setting personal boundaries with yourself. And that can feel inflexible or rigid or like you're missing out. If you have to say no to your own things that you're interested in, that can feel kind of like it's a bummer sometimes, to use a technical term. All right, the other is that sometimes we don't want to look judgmental. So if you are choosing to put your priorities above another person, or even setting your own boundaries and saying, oh no, I'm not going to do that because I want to make sure I do this, we're expressing our boundaries and that we are setting them and that we are looking after ourselves. And if another person is not doing the same, it can feel like our decision and our setting boundaries is judgment on another person, of our way of saying, oh, well, I'm taking care of myself and I guess you aren't. We can kind of feel like that's happening. Even if that's not, that can be a detraction, that we look like we're taking steps to take care of ourselves and we're saying that other people who don't set boundaries aren't doing the same. Well, we'll get to the belief behind that in the next one. And then finally, just stress. It sounds backwards, but oftentimes when we think about setting boundaries, whether it's the time it takes to clarify the boundaries or when we're trying to make sure that we're enacting them and maintaining them, it can feel like a lot. It can feel stressful to think about saying no to people, to maybe changing our behavior. All of that stuff can feel like a lot of stress. And so that is a fear that people will experience when they're trying to set those boundaries. It sounds really stressful, especially for those of us who need to work on it. Now, when it comes to the beliefs, what are the things that are driving us to feel those fears? Well, when it comes to harm to relationships, a lot of us have this fear that setting boundaries hurts people. If I say no to someone, it might hurt their feelings. If I tell someone I don't want to discuss something or that that's off the table, that will hurt their feelings, that they'll be damaged somehow. It's like, feels like we're closing up or we're putting up walls. But in actual fact, you're just being really clear on the nature of your relationship, what's okay, what's not okay, and it's a way of respecting. And maybe it actually means that you are having more respect for your relationship because you're willing to be clear on what's okay and what is not. You're also showing another person how you can set boundaries in a healthy way and to look out for yourself. The other thing is if you don't set boundaries in a relationship, they might start to be impacted anyway. So you might start to build up resentment towards your relationship, or there might be some divisiveness that is starting to emerge. And so when we think, oh, boundaries will harm it, it might put up walls, that's not always the case. Maybe not setting boundaries might harm a relationship. All right, if we go to the next belief, we might have a belief that you should put other people first. This comes up a lot, especially there are some of us who tend to be people pleasers or we like to acquiesce to others, whether we want to keep the peace or whether it's just our personality. This is the type of thing where we can feel like setting a boundary feels like we're putting ourselves over another person. Whether that's saying no to someone or just how we decide to spend our time and what we spend it on, it can feel like we are being selfish. And it's worth asking that question of, is it selfish to make sure you're taking care of yourself and that you are being careful about how you spend your time and your energy? It's really taking care of your mental health, in many ways your physical health, what you can take on and what you can't. It's being really clear about those things. And so maybe you can challenge this belief to say, I'm actually healthier and I can take care of other people better when I take care of myself first. It's like putting on the oxygen mask in the plane before you put it on others. The other is sometimes we feel like boundaries are rigid. And when it comes to this idea that setting a boundary is rigid, well, maybe we can challenge that belief that boundaries don't necessarily have to stay the same. Depends on the time you're in your life, what is going on, what are you trying to accomplish, what do your days look like? Also, let's take into account stress. For example, if you are spending a lot of time at home, like many of us are, not everyone, but many of us are spending a lot of time at home. And so technically, we might have more time to catch up with a friend. However, a lot of us are spending a lot of time on Zoom calls and we're having fatigue of constantly being looking at a camera or being on a screen if this is the way that we primarily connect with people. And so even though you might have the time right now, you need to say, what do I need? And if I need to step away from the camera, from the Zoom calls, etc., maybe I have to say no to some of these things right now. And this doesn't stay that way forever. Hopefully, this is the type of thing where we can adjust, and boundaries are not always going to be super rigid. But I know there are people, including myself, who sometimes struggle when it comes to boundaries, feeling like we are suddenly inflexible and that we are limiting ourselves in some way. Okay. The other is that we feel like saying no means missing out. This might be a belief that causes us to not want to say no to things. And here's the truth. Yeah, you're probably missing out on some things because everything is a trade-off. We cannot do every single thing we want to do. But here's the other thing, that many of us who are struggling with boundaries, we're doing things that maybe we don't want to be doing. And so the more that we get clarity, we step back and ask those questions at the start, we can start to make sure we're spending more time doing the things we like and less time maybe on those things that we don't. But when it comes to missing out, you have to remember it's a trade-off. But changing that belief around whether it is more worth your while to be spending time on things that you've predetermined are valuable for you means that you're getting what you need, you're aligned with your values and your principles. And so technically you might be missing out on something, but when you maintain those boundaries, it's probably that your life is feeling a lot better when you're acting within those boundaries. What is another belief? So another one that we might have is my boundaries make other people feel bad about themselves. So this is related to that fear that will come across as judgmental if we actually stick to and we're clear on our boundaries. So this is something that we want to unpack, is that maybe it's true in some cases. Maybe us being clear on our boundaries might make another person feel uncomfortable. They might feel judged. But does that mean they always feel judged? Does that mean you are judging them? No. So this is the type of thing we need to spend a little bit of time pushing back on that belief that you setting boundaries is a way of judging other people. It's really a way of appreciating yourself and also showing other people how they might be able to do the same. Now, another one is it's too stressful. So when we think it's overwhelming to set boundaries, this is an area where, well, it's stressful to set boundaries, but it's also stressful to not set boundaries. And at the start, if you are just getting your feet wet and you're just practicing saying no, you're just starting to identify what your values and your principles are, yeah, at the start, it might be stressful. It might take time for you to really get clear, to start making those changes, to start saying no to things that previously you didn't. And this is the type of thing that can feel stressful. However, it is also one of those things that as you get better at it, the stress will start to alleviate and you'll start to feel a lot better and calmer, and you're taking care of yourself and you're really prioritizing the things that matter to you. And in the long run, that is less stressful. So this is another one that is really worth pushing back on. Now, when it comes to setting boundaries, really what I want you to do is always start at the top. So what information are you missing? And in this particular case, I really want you to spend the time to ask what is important to you. How do you want to spend your time? How do you want to feel? And what are your boundaries? What are the things that you will allow into your life, and what are the things that don't belong there and that are not welcome in your life? And then you have to figure out what are the steps you need to take in order to make that happen. But you also then want to go to that next level, which is what works for you? What are some ways that you can help keep those boundaries and those structures in your life? How can you support it and set it up around you? So now you've made the decision, what does that look like? And finally, you have to look at these beliefs, that third layer. The third way we get stuck is to unpack what are some beliefs that I have about setting boundaries and maintaining boundaries. What are the beliefs I have about saying no to things, about not doing everything right away that I want, about shutting down a conversation that is outside of your boundaries? What are those things that you believe that might be interfering? How do you test them? How do you challenge them? Maybe look at other people who do a really good job of setting boundaries. How do they behave? How do they act? How do you see them? Do you think that they're being selfish because they're taking care of themselves, or because they're being really clear on what is and what is not welcome in their life? This is the order I want you to go in, but do make sure you spend a little bit of time trying to unpack those beliefs. And when we do that, you can start to get clear on your boundaries, you can figure out what works for you, and you can start to get rid of any of those beliefs that might be getting in your way of taking care of yourself and setting boundaries that work for you.